So
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel. We are flash fiction writers who approach it in non-traditional ways and in interesting ways. And these are some of the best stories I've read in a long time. I've been just so delighted preparing for this panel because I've learned so much from what all of these writers have done. The structure, they play with structure, they play with form, they play with ways into meaning. And so what we're going to do tonight for me this morning for all of you in New Zealand is to have each of our writers read some of their work, and then we'll ask some questions and find out what it is they're doing and why they've chosen alternative routes into flash fiction. And we're going to start today with Roberta Berry, who's in Ireland. So hi, Roberta.
Hi there. Hi, everybody, and thanks to the panel, Michelle and John, for having me on. I am a dual citizen of Ireland and the US, grew up in New York City, and I travel the world as the roving ambassador for the Haiku Society. So I've spent a bit of time in North Island and South Island, New Zealand, doing that. I also write haibun, which is a prose form that includes haiku. Some people call it a prose poetry, some people call it a form of flash fiction. I don't really identify it in any particular way, but for those of you who are interested in the form, I just co-authored a book called Haibun, A Writer's Guide, which is published by Ad Hoc Fiction this month. So I'm going to read a haibun that was in response to a Rattle magazine's Poet Responds prompt, which is where you read something in the paper and then you write something in response to it. And this one was picked up by editor Tim Green, and I had read that Janice Ian had made her last album at age 70, and I grew up listening to her music. So the haibun is called "When I Read About Janice Ian, I Am the Same, Only Different." Smoking pot in the cafeteria with my friend Susan singing Society's Child, and I sing along, our matching flower shirts like we'd stumbled into a field of buttercups, and we're staring at a sky of blue butterflies. We don't see the gum stuck under the table because we're stoned and the teachers don't give a shit. And I want to be Janice Ian strumming a guitar. But today I have piano. And when I get home, Susan's in the backyard crying. And I sneak her into my room. And her married brother bangs the front door screaming, "You tell my sister, I'll beat the crap out of that guy if he ever shows up again." And Susan and I hide out all afternoon playing Society's Child on my big sister's stereo. Careful, the needle doesn't scratch because she'd kill me. And when my sister beeps, we take the steps 2 at a time. And for once, she's nice and gives Susan a ride to her mom's. And the decades roll by and Susan and I lose track. But I send her my book anyway. And she calls and talks about the old days. And I tell her, Janice Ian says she's done with music and writes haiku now. And I am the same as I was that day in the cafeteria, and different too, which is hard to explain. But after I find Susan's address, I pencil a paper with buttercups and 3 lines that say, "Rising from the pebbled path, blue butterfly."
All right. It's gorgeous. Now, I'm a lover of Haibun, and when Basho invented the form or perfected the form, he thought of it as sort of the travel form. And so the prose section is what he sees that is extraordinary about the place, and the poem, the haiku at the end, is what the moment between moments. It's haikus are. Yours to me feels like a kind of time travel story. And I'm wondering
Well,
if you
I,
check.
I do. I mean, Basho is, the touchstone for Haiban poetry, as he wrote in the 1600s. And The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I recommend anybody who doesn't have it. You can buy it practically anywhere in the world. His travelogue written in the Haiban style. I think of this particular Haiban about Janissy more as kind of a flash memoir that includes
Mm,
haiku at the end and makes it part of the flash story. I do have a few flash fictions like that incorporate haiku into them. I don't really think of those particular ones as haiban. This one I do think of as a haiban, but it's a very fluid term. And as I'm also for like the past 10 years or more, the haiban editor at the print journal Modern Haiku. So I see a lot of submissions, especially from students in MFA programs, because haiban suddenly become like a hot, it's trending maybe in MFA programs. And, often as an editor, because we get so many submissions, I read the haiku first. And if you can't write haiku, you're not going to be able to
mm,
write a haibun. So
mm,
a lot of these submissions are very well structured in the prose section. And then the title is kind of a throwaway. And then the haiku is like 575,
mhm.
sort of like a synopsis of the prose. So that's basically what not to do in haibun. I mean, it's really, for me, a three-part form, a title that grabs the reader, as same in flash fiction you want to read. Then the prose that tells a story, can be real or imagined, and then the haiku that takes it to the next level. And the haiku can be anywhere it can be like smack in the middle of the prose. It can be three lines that form, kind of a mini painting interspersed with the pose. I mean, it's a very fluid form. You can do lots of different things with it, but you do have to know how to write haiku well to write a haibun. So
With your with your haiku, do you include the element of the seasonal element?
I don't I don't necessarily. I mean, there's a distinction that haiku has to have a kigo, some people think, which is a season word. And if you're not writing that, you're writing about human experience, which some call senru. That's going back to the Japanese forms. I'm much more, I mean, I'm gender fluid in my identity, and I'm like gender fluid in my haiba. I don't know if that makes sense to people, but I do believe in the mixing up the forms quite a bit and being experimental. But of course, you do have to understand the basic structure before you start experimenting. I think that's a good thing to do. To start reading as much basho as you want, and then move on to through the centuries, and eventually you'll get to me. And I do encourage people to use it, especially if I've taught it, I've facilitated. I don't like to say I teach, because I'm not sure these forms can really be taught, but I facilitate in nursing homes, and that taps into the memories of the residents. I usually start with an object, a favorite object. I've done, like whole series of workshops on haiban and memory, and, using old letters or passports, documents, photographs. And it's really a very evocative form. and highly resonant, and you can change. You can have the haiku in the future or the past and the prose in the present. The best way to write, if you're starting, is to follow those short clipped sentences in the present tense, and not to get too caught up in hyperbole or poetic jargon. I don't know how if I'm, simplicity is best in hybrid.
I've learned so much already, Roberta. This is fantastic. And I would say form fluid works for you. Gender fluid and form fluid.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, we got a lot of, you're playing with form. You're taking a look at different structures and things, as does, and this is transition time, as does David, who I found your approach to really, this feels more a poem than a prose piece to me. And I wonder if you could introduce yourself and read your poem.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so the poem I'm going to read is called View Finder, and it's set out in 2 columns, and I'm going to read the left column down, then I'm going to read the right column down, then I'm going to zigzag across left to right down using exactly the same language, and we'll see what happens, and I'll talk to what happens, and I'm sure John will prize a bit more than I'm prepared to volunteer first time round out of me. View Finder, for Michelle Liggett. Tell it like it is, as if among 100 dark things, a quiver in the vanishing, like blades of grass. Finder. We take our bearings from blue herons, line after line, a quiver, they're turning. View Finder. Tell it like it is, as if we take our bearings among 100 dark things, from blue herons, a quiver in the vanishing, line after line, a quiver, like blades of grass, they're turning. What's happening there? I think I need to go back. I need to go back, as John has asked me, invited me to, and say that when I was a teenager, while I read a lot of poetry, British and American mainly, but also many of the translations that came through from Spanish, Italian, Russian in particular, I listened and I honed my ear mainly from listening to jazz piano, solo jazz piano records I had a binge on. You know how teenagers kind of get obsessed with something. They get obsessed with a TV series or a particular writer, or this is the greatest guitarist ever. Well, I got obsessed with solo jazz piano records. And I listened in particular to a Canadian pianist, Paul Bley, in an album called Open to Love, where it occurred to me for the first time, given that I was only 15, 16, that I could hear the melody that he wasn't playing. In other words, I learned that one of the things that I might be able to do if I hone my skills in language was essentially have a narrative, and it was a narrative line as far as I was concerned when I was a teenager, that wasn't spoken, that the silence would basically announce a subplot if we were writing a novel. And so I've been working for 40 plus years to try and do that. And Flash seems to me one way of doing it, but you're right, John, this is essentially conceived of as a grid poem. And I was born, for better or worse, in the generation in New Zealand that adopted postmodernism, but I didn't adopt postmodernism. As I've said to many people, not all of us were lost in the forest of postmodernism. I apologize if there's any offense given. I was always concerned with narrative, and basically I read for character. And when I was a teenager, my favorite writer was Dostoevsky, who seems to me not exactly the greatest plotter of books, but it's certainly a superb exploratory exercise in character. And so I tried to bring character and narrative when they were unfashionable into my work, but I wanted some formal tests, like most young people. I wanted to measure myself, and I couldn't basically do that through the templates that were being provided by postmodernism, even though that was supposedly revolutionary. What I could do was enjoy my readings of people like Robert Browning and Chaucer and Christopher Marlowe, and then come at them with a very limited formal vocabulary, understanding that what attracted me in the high points of these writers was what wasn't being said. You know, I mean, Browning in particular, in his dramatic monologues, he has a text and then he has the text between the lines. And at his best, he's a master at it. I learned a lot from him, or I tried to learn a lot from him. So let's try and condense that. What do I think about language? Well, language is quite literally the history of being human. It is what the dead leave us. Basically, they introduced words, they modified the initial meanings of words. They turned a word that in 1750 was largely positive into a pejorative term in 1850. And if we are using a combination of words, we could choose, there's no tyranny of the should, but we could choose, and I do choose, to be aware of the multiple meanings historically that the word has had. And I do this, of course, by looking at dictionaries. I'm not claiming to be particularly insightful. This is just a matter of looking up a dictionary and having fun on a rainy day. What I do with this poem, this text, is I dedicate it to Michelle Leggett. Michelle Leggett is a former poet laureate of New Zealand. She's a longtime colleague, but she's also fully blind. She wasn't born blind, and she progressively over about 15 years went blind from an untreatable condition. So she had moments of, let's say, lucidity visually, and they've informed her poetry post-blindness. And I wanted this piece to capture the sense of how her perceptual world was changing, but not through an act of will, not through attentiveness on her part. It was imposed on her. And I wanted to reflect, without pushing the reader to draw a conclusion, that this is in fact in a lesser, and certainly a less violent way, what happens to all of us. If you study something long enough, indeed not for very long at all, you find that it moves on you. And essentially my poetry and my flash fiction is an exercise in, you know, cubist portraiture, I call it. I'm trying to walk around a fixed object. And as I walk around it, lo and behold, the object isn't fixed at all. And this seems to me inherent in the nature of language, because calling something a stone is not the same, of course, as holding a stone, to come back to that basic 101, you know, philosophical axiom. And there's no way around that. But there is a way to harness all five senses when you're writing, so that the reader can choose to prioritize one sense over the other. They don't have to go with sight, which you'd imagine is the only thing available to you when you're using language, but it's not. And they can place themselves to a greater or lesser degree in the work. I'm not interested, and by the way, this is not a rejection of other forms of writing. It's announcing a preference. I'm not interested in being told that war is a bad idea. I'm not interested in being told that we shouldn't use plastic so much. I'm respectful when those points are made, nuanced manner, using fine language, but excuse me, I want the language to do something that is an inquiry rather than a conclusion. And so I think of everything I write as an inquiry, and I think of the failed things I've written largely as conclusions. They were dead before I started working on them. They could not be resuscitated, whatever level of skill or attention I brought to them. Over to you, John.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think about the structure. I have the good fortune of having read your poem, right? And it's what, 30 words long, and I'm a pretty fast reader, and it took me 5-10 minutes of reading, not because I was confused, but I was finding multiple meanings, and I was finding different ways into it, and it's just a really gorgeous both poem and structure, and it develops ideas. I think it's just interesting. To me, it comes off the page a little bit, so that it's in my head. I'm thinking about it, and it's not all here. It's my interaction with it that makes the difference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I feel chuffed. I feel like a little 6-year-old who's just been praised by a parent. Well, look, there are many, many different ways of writing, and there are many different ways of reading. And in what I said before, if it sounded strong, again, I want to reinforce it's a personal preference. I have friends who are very involved with eco-poetics. Robin Marie Pickens is not a close friend, but a Dunedin-based writer, and she is formally inventive. And when I read her work, I feel that I'm given space to inform myself and take hints and draw conclusions I'm not being preached to. And this I respect in other writers. I don't need to agree with positions, but I need to be given room, or at least I feel I need to be given room. And conversely, I feel I need to give room to readers to draw their conclusions, because I don't have any particular wisdom, alas.
All right. Well, why don't we move to Jenna, whose work is experimental as well.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Jenna Heller. I am originally from the US, outside of New York City, Connecticut, and New York. Also spent some time in Texas, and I now live in Christchurch, and I write fiction and poetry. So the piece I'm going to read today is The Change. That she'd started sleepwalking at the age of 47 wasn't completely unexpected. Creeping about the house at 2 a.m, making tea, playing solitaire, even cleaning the fish tank. Leaving the house, though, that was new. At first, she'd wake at the bus stop just as the early commuters arrived, slink home to make breakfast for the kids, then send them off to school like everything was normal. But some days later, when she found herself at the end of the pier one morning, walking the dunes the next, and searching for sand dollars in waist-deep water the morning after that, well, she knew then time was thin. Her grandmother had disappeared in a pond at 49, her own mother in a lake at 48. After the hot flashes and mood swings, they'd slipped through the night in search of water, and now she watched her own body change in unexpected ways. The skin between her fingers grew sticky and webbed, her eyes red and itchy. And when 5 faint scratch marks appeared at both sides of her neck, she knew it was only a matter of time. Then one night, after a day of gagging in the thick summer heat, she stacked the diaries of explanation on the table and allowed the sea breeze to lull her to sleep. The next day, the house was silent, the back door wide open, and her clothes found tangled in the kelp at high tide.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's interesting as well. Like, this is a story that happens in a short amount of time, but it's expansive, right? It looks at all these generations of women. I'm just wondering how you're playing with this, and the way what you're saying about the societal expectations of women and that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, I wish that it was that planned. I was thinking about what's my process, I very rarely sit down and start writing and then discover something. It usually starts with a line in my head. And I have a distinct memory of standing at my kitchen sink washing dishes, remembering a very good friend of mine who was a prolific sleepwalker and would walk outside, and she'd not be knocking on people's doors. And I was thinking, well, what could I do with that? And I just sort of let it go in my head before I actually sit down to write. But you know how in life you can make sense of things, but only after you've been through them and you're looking back? That's really how I approach the writing of my flash. So I wrote the story, and then I looked back at it and thought, so what? Where's the so what? How does this experience actually impact people? Where's the connection? And I started to bring in, well, what if it was a life, this is the change. I didn't necessarily set out to write about going through menopause, being in perimenopause, but ultimately that's what I've done. And I just go back through and I try to find the words and stitch the connections together as though I were telling a story in the future about something that happened in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for you, the process is about discovery and then revision.
Absolutely.
That's great. Do you feel that your subconscious is giving you then cues to help you write your work?
I think so. over the years, I have taken to thinking about themes that I'd like to write about and interesting approaches, particularly in relation to the theme of love. I mean, isn't everything about love in some to some extent? But how can I write about love in a new way, or approach a theme in a new way? And I kind of work it out in my head, usually over a 2-week period before I even sit down. And then I write the story that feels fun and exciting or interesting to me. And then I go back and I really look at word choice, phrasing. And I think similar to what David was saying around creating some gaps and creating the space in the words between the phrases for readers to stitch it together for themselves as well, so they can have the aha moments themselves. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. With this level of concision, you really do have to.
I think so. And I find it both frustrating and really an exciting challenge. I really appreciate the revision process far more than I do the getting the first draft down on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't we move to Charlotte and her story, her work? You're on mute, Charlotte.
See, I knew I would do that. I'm Charlotte Hamrick. I live in New Orleans, and I came to writing late in life. I didn't start writing creatively until I was in my early 50s. So I think that's a little bit different from a lot of writers. But I have this piece called Ida is Axing. The first 3 words, the title, is also a part of the story. And this was published in 2022 flash flood. Ida is axing her way out of this world. The sizzling metal smell of it, the swollen purple eye of it, the dull scissors edge of it. Ida is axing the oak-treed, ice-teed fakery of it, the caves and mazes and smothering sinkholes, the grasping hive-mind hands of it, the well-trodden path, the jack-booted righteous steps of it, thought thickets and poison ivy clamoring for her brain. Ida is axing her way out of this world, from smiling paper dolls who vanish at a touch, from blank checks and nip and tucks, from wombless robots that can only pretend. Ida is axing dizzy slide puzzles, fickle-screened crosswords, the endless monopoly of me, me, me that drags her through the mud of it. The gold man statues and designer ball gowns, the perfect partner, the postcard vacay, the two-sided face of it. Ida is axing down the flagpole and resewing the flag.
Absolutely love. Yeah, and one of the things that jumped out immediately about me is your use of an afro with that. Ida is coming back over again and again and again, and it conveyed to me not like obsessiveness, but something a kind of strength in Ida. And I wonder if that's what's intended, or what were you trying to convey there?
Well, the story about this piece is that I was on social media, and I was typing, I don't know, a tweet or something, I don't even remember, but autocorrect corrected it to Ida is axing. And I thought, that's interesting. That is interesting. What can I do with that? So I thought about it a couple of days, and there were things going on social media that, you know how it is. There's always some kind of discourse or something. And so I kind of made this my thoughts, really, of social media, the not so fun, not so nice side of social media. And so it's, yeah, you're right. It's, I was kind of, I guess, working out my feelings in the moment. And I just wrote it in a few minutes, and I did a very little revision. And about that time, it was flash flood submissions was coming around. I was like, oh, I'll throw it in there and just see what happens. And they accepted it. So, that's basically the story of how it came to be.
That's great. I feel very close to Ida somehow, but I don't know any of the details of her life, which I find really interesting. You haven't set in a place, or she's not doing a thing, but I kind of feel for her, and like, how do you do that? That's fantastic.
I don't know actually, because I don't think about structure or genre or anything when I write. I just write. Whatever I'm thinking or feeling or reacting to, and I don't worry about what label to slap on it. And then later, when I decide I want to submit it, then I kind of just think, okay, well, what is this? So I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's a prose poem. I don't know if it's a microfiction. It's just what happened.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to agree with you here that the label flash fiction or not flash fiction is less important to them than just delivering a kind of moment or a piece or something, And so, do you have any opinion? Is this flash fiction? Is this poetry? Is this, or does it matter?
To me, it doesn't matter. I kind of like the hybrid world. I kind of like like I said, not labeling things, but I'm just going to guess, since Flash Flood accepted it, that it's a flash.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's a good transition to Ivy, who has a piece for us as well.
Hello, my name is Ivy Alvarez. I am going to go against the format a little and read three short pieces. This first one is documentary. She is full of walking. Miles flow from her toes. Mud coats the first cuneiform bone. A bomb she eats and eats again. Anything will do, even stones, just to plug the maw that sits like a cavern. All mouth, all teeth, all claw, all jaw. She has nothing to feed it. Her voice is thin, her eyes punched holes. This can't be happening. It is always happening. All she can do is walk. Syrupy. Spine of the world, its curvature sheer. Here, consider each tangle. Impossible at this angle. A honeyed slickening, skin scaffolding, thin viscosity whips falling. How much vertigo our earth divests for the ceiling. So crystalline. Everything begs for licking, a taste of armature, pure musculature, sweet architecture. Such a candid space between these buildings. A teeth of stones, shadows, signposts, blinds, a muscled bite, concrete bones beneath each bright surface. Right, simply scurfless. Open doors to cavities, decay, every roof shiny with condensation, haze. Let's scoop the drops, boil it up, reduce, evaporate. Vilasana. I ate and ate the gift I was given, the use by date months forgotten and checked too late. I expelled the poison in a ferment, in pain, white walls so bland and impassive, letting it all pass without comment. This gift was a softness, sweet, the poisoning innocent, a mistake, I'm sure. I went back to it, a dog to its sick, unknowing, my ignorance of punishment, avoiding, a disembowelment from a long time ago. Darkness and the cold coming on, the sweetness meant as a balm, a succor, some talismanic comfort. How it turned against me. It all turned against me, and I let it. I ate it willingly. Filipino idiom meaning very sleepy, literally spoiled, referring to fish.
All right. Well, thank you. Like as with Charlotte's stories, I feel close to the characters, but we don't get details of their lives. We don't get. I'm not even sure you can rightly call them characters, but it still feels to me like fiction. Do you feel this is fiction? Do you think this is poetry, or like Charlotte, do you not just care at all? I mean, I'm putting words into Charlotte's mouth, but yeah.
I guess it's more about enjoying what I'm doing, enjoying what I'm writing in the moment that I'm writing it. If it's giving me that sort of I don't know, that brain tingle after I've written it. I'm happy to just see where it lands. So, yeah.
That's what is the process for you in developing these pieces?
So for the very last one, the Filipino idiom ones, that's a form that I sort of came to because I wanted to directly engage with the Filipino idiom and then respond to the Filipino idiom with either a poem or a prose poem or however that happens. And so, so the Filipino idiom sort of dictated how I was going to respond to it. With the others, I mean, with Syrupy, that's mostly with me enjoying the sound of language. And with documentary, was in response to an image that I saw.
So is the Filipino idiom, is that in Tagalog or?
Yes, it's in Tagalog. Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. Then you're mixing the two language and the two heritages.
Yes.
Do you do that often? Do you play with the interplay between Tagalog and English?
Not usually. This was for a huge project that I was working on, the very last thing that I was working on for poetry. So yes, it was huge, but I don't usually, up until then, that I mostly concentrated on flexing on both languages.
I like that. That's great. Flexing on both. That's really cool. That's really wonderful. Okay, that might be a good moment to transition to Lola. And there you are.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Hello. I'm Lola Elvey. Part of my role in the National Flash thing is I actually I run the youth competition for National Flash Fiction Day, which is facilitating some of these panels. So that's been very exciting to watch all of the panels last weekend, and then I'm looking forward to the ones later on this afternoon. I'm a musician and I'm studying music at university, music and applied mathematics, and so most of my writing, I think there's a strong correlation between the musicality of language and actually putting words onto paper for me. And a lot of my writing, perhaps as a result, kind of feels like poetry to me. I think of it in terms of poetry. But of course, like some people have referenced already today, that distinction between poetry, prose, flash fiction is kind of very nuanced, and where the story lies, whether the story is actually in the character or the details or the ideas, that's all kind of up for debate in this very nuanced form. So today I thought I'd read a poem or a kind of experimental thing that's part of this. It's part of this series that I'm working on that's kind of creative nonfiction or poetry nonfiction. I thought I want to try to use my poetry to talk a bit more about the world as opposed to just focusing on my kind of immediate surroundings. So this piece is called On This Fine Earth, Shapeless. Sometimes the night is darker than you'd like. Sometimes your hands reach farther than mine. These days when summer seems so far and we talk of colder climates, with snow so bright it lights our souls from miles away, I tell you this world is strange. Your quiet love is waiting for some indigo gradient, that blue-red sunset. Your quiet love astounds me, shakes me where I sit twisting my cup between my hands like some nervous form of prayer. Where does this ground lead? I am trying to keep my bearing in a spinning, expanding, timeless place. Our sense of space overwhelms me. This distance is uncountable. As much as we measure, guess, What are you waiting for with your hands spread just so? What on this fine earth allows for so much patience? Such a pause between our breaths that I could mistake you for sleeping. Desire is not a thing you decide. It is a force that pushes you towards something larger than yourself. Some things cannot always be determined. Some things are only ever shapeless. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so there's I've read a little bit of your work beyond this, and it seems to me that there's a good deal of intimacy between you and your readers, right? You're really allowing people in, and you're taking a look at just the very small moments, exploring how meaningful those small moments are. And are you doing that consciously, or is this just something that's happening?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's maybe a little bit deliberate, but I'm actually very glad to hear that comes across, because I think that's something that I used to struggle with, this kind of, actually exposing that kind of vulnerability and figuring out how to make what I'm saying feel real to others as well, because it doesn't, I'm sure, as everybody with writing can agree, it's one thing to write something, but then to actually convey that to somebody else reading it, it always feels real to you when you write it. And I do like trying to use those details to kind of ground these loftier ideas that one might come across in poetry. It's one thing to use language to talk about the world in a certain way, or to describe, these things that are always difficult to articulate, but then those details, maybe for me, they do provide some kind of anchoring to physical existence that we can't really, even when we talk about abstract writing, we are still anchored in the physical world.
Mm-hmm. Do you see your writing as abstract?
I don't know. I think it used to be more abstract, perhaps. I think that for me, I always imagine my writing is definitely more on the poetic side than the storytelling side, which somehow always implies more abstract in my mind. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. But definitely trying to draw on those concrete details is something that I think it's a good exercise also in just anchoring yourself. I think that it's interesting for me to think about, if I were to articulate this moment, what details are important that I can actually describe that hint at something a little bit broader than the details themselves. And I thought it was interesting, actually, something that David said earlier about sight, and how sight is, he said something about, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly, but something about how sight is maybe one of the first things we think of talking about in our writing. And I find that for me, it's often actually physical touch, or something more tangible than sight, the way the air feels or the way the light feels, that they have a kind of a physical impact on your body that is more than just color.
Yeah, and by doing that, you're letting us into the character, right? You're letting us inhabit the character's body.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm really glad to hear that comes across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay. So why don't we talk to Elizabeth, and then maybe we can open this up to a more of a conversation after Elizabeth. So.
Hey, so I'm Liz Morton, and I'm a poet and teller of yarns from Auckland, although the US and kind of Western noir seems to seep into my stuff sometimes. I have no idea why. It's very bizarre. It might have been country and westerns that I watched as a kid on like daytime telly or something, but I don't know. But I'm going to read a poem, maybe it's a poem, called Cowboys Are an Animal Left Too Long. The tea bag left too long in the sky, steeping red. The hackberry struck by headlights, wild and afraid, cuffed by the end of another day. I used to have a name here. I arrived in dreams, running like you, past the smoked out manger, through a brush fire where even the birds are lit. Marsh rabbits and wood rats shiver in the ash-cut stilt grasses. We were animals once, venom and teeth and mandibles, all set forward and hungry. You licked all surfaces, tonguing the bark splinters and the hot tars. I fed the deer and the old milk cow, and you sharpened a picture of a state down south, where the wasps knit a paper nest called Confederacy, where names are just things to be taken to the storm drain and drowned, kittens lapping the gunpowder off your palms. I remember watching cowboys on a Sunday afternoon from a couch at the bottom of the world, popcorn and kettle chips, a tea bag left too long in the mug. You used to have a name here. We ran through the cabbage trees, past the pylons, all humming with dreams. Brown sheep, white sheep, black sheep. We walked the suburbs and wondered if we'd see spurs or a holster like you see in the real outback, in a shopping mall, in a stadium, in a mosque. It felt so far away. Men walking through the saloon doors with a gun. We used to play it in the yard with the sprinklers and the dog. Did you see him? We'd say, yap-yapping and shooting our finger pistols. Did you see this happening? We'd say later. Did you? Thanks.
All right. So again, really interesting. And again, we've been coming this whole hour, the distinction between poetry and fiction, and if there is any. And here it's interesting because the first thing I thought of, you've got it's flowing text like prose, but you have caesuras and you have parts that kind of look like a Lawrence Ferlinghetti poem. And you're really using those gaps and those breaks in an interesting way. And I'm wondering what is your technique for that?
Well, I mean, my poetry can be like eating a lump of dry Weet Bix. I don't know if you guys have that in the States, but it's like a breakfast cereal that's like compact. And yeah, I think so spaces for me are like milk. They kind of aerate the poem, they create an opening. But I like them for the way they can kind of create a cognitive panting. Like they kind of provide a quick and sometimes seemingly like random opportunity to catch your breath, and that sort of drawn out space can counterintuitively like quicken the pace of things. And I kind of hope to like induce some kind of giddy hyperventilation in my reader, but I don't know, I just but they're kind of sometimes they're like ghosts. They kind of spook the text. They kind of cause a bit of mischief to the syntax, so they're not always where you expect them to be. They can kind of give weight to words by framing them, or like even like whole clusters of words. They can kind of just border off. I like David's kind of sense of like gaps kind of providing space for the reader, but I don't know that my gaps are that altruistic. My gaps are kind of I feel like they're very much.
You know what it forced me to do in a pleasant way is to consider and reconsider what it is, what you were saying and what you were doing with the lines and what the meaning of the piece was for me.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's really effective in your work. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of like sometimes having a drum roll, and being like dum, and then boom, like you can kind of put the punchline. So I don't know. I mean, it kind of, I feel like it shifts it from being a straight poem to being something a little more. I don't know. As a younger poet, I had a very much a hemispheric kind of idea of what poetry was. It kind of didn't kind of bump against the right hand margin of the page, and it was a slightly naive view of it, whereas I think now like there's more flex in that. And I think for me, like poetry and flash fiction that almost adhere to a slightly different metaphysics. You know, it's like but there is that room for like an access way between the two forms that kind of allows you to kind of haul things through a spatio-temporal kind of domain, like storytelling seems to do, but also gives that kind of defiance of that as well, like with a like fragmented now. So
Yeah,
I guess the spaces are the fragments.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I love the way you talk about your writing, the metaphysics of it. I also am intrigued because, of course, I haven't read this piece. I've only heard the piece, and the two of you are talking about the structure. The structure in my mind doesn't necessarily come through when I hear it. And so I'm really fascinated to read it now, to see it on the page.
Right, because I don't necessarily breathe where the spaces are. It's more a cognitive thing. Like it's like, something that comes through in the text rather than,
I'm gonna describe it. It's a perfectly square piece that has caesuras. I think every line, but if not every line, many lines, and that causes you to stop and say, "Oh my gosh, what's happening here?" And so it's justified both sides. So it's interesting. And, you know, so I think all of us here, including me, are experimental flash fiction writers, and who also work in poetry, right? And so I just want to open that up. And do y'all make a distinction between poetry and flash fiction? Should there be a distinction made? Should we leave that to the scholars rather than the artists? What do y'all think? Yeah, David.
Okay, so for me, I think I hope I've established that language is revelatory. It's a journey of discovery, and therefore when I start writing a piece, I'm more interested in finding a way of saying than in having something to say, because by finding a way of saying, I'm letting the history of being human, this sounds grand, all lowercase, mediate itself into the text, and therefore the text, if I attend closely, if I'm precise in my framing, should be more interesting than I can ever manage to be just by myself. That's the expectation I bring and have brought for many decades. So I draw a pretty strong distinction actually between poetry and prose. And I've heard some pretty eminent New Zealand poets say that they're not really bothered. I mean, Jenny Bornholt has gone on record as saying that, and several of her colleagues in Wellington have echoed that. It's not for me to in any way take away from their assessment of their own process. That is obviously ridiculous for me to attempt. But I can say definitively that that's not the case with me, because lineation is basically, for me, it's the syntax of active silence. Lineation is primarily how I activate as sense units the silences, the pauses, the spaces between words in each line. In other words, if I just said, there are silences in this poem, you go, oh, gee, thanks, David, that's really helpful. Especially if the poem's 30 lines, 50 lines, and in some cases 180 lines. So I treat each line as a sense unit, not in the words on the line, often break those sense units, but in terms of the silence. And the lineation gives the reader the space, the cue, the opportunity, not the imperative, to go in. And the reason I do that is slow release. It's simply not perceptually possible, in my view as a writer, to go with the whole. It's not helpful. I break it up. It's a scientific method, really, and it's quite deliberate. But flash fiction doesn't attend to that. When I write flash fiction, I mean, you, in your question to Lola, pointed out that often her lineation does seem to, in fact, be working as poetry. Again, valid judgment. When I'm writing flash fiction, it's basically right to left. I don't break up. I don't have short lines. I don't even insert dialogue if there's dialogue. I tend to ignore those conventions because I'm looking for the rhythm to be almost a movement in music. You know, I want it to go through several printed lines without there being any more than one line, actually, in terms of the sense or senses. And that's not true in poetry. It's quite opposite. So I see them as opposed in my practice, but I don't necessarily read them as opposed when I'm reading other practitioners or when I listen to you.
Yeah. Well, how about other people? Because we had some really interesting, work here. That do you see, or do you agree with David for your own work, or do you approach it differently? No, nobody wants to jump. Oh yeah,
I'll jump in. I find that I write in whatever form makes sense for the piece, but I will come back to it later and I will jam it all together into a force justified paragraph and see, does that work? And I'll take it apart and put it into different lines and stanzas. And, I play with the form a lot, and I have some flash pieces which definitely started as poems, and I was solid in that. These are poems and they shall remain poems. And then I finally gave that up and was like, actually, I think it kind of works better as a prose piece. I don't tend to find that it goes the other way. And then one of the things I find frustrating is, as I've heard everybody here say, it's kind of hard to distinguish. Is this a poem, or is this prose? Is this flash? Is it fiction? What is it? Is it memoir? The frustrating piece is that if you go to submit these things to journals, they require you to make this distinction. Is fiction or poetry? And it's like, can you guys decide? I just want to submit my piece to your journal.
That's great. Well, if you go to the Journal of Radical Wonder, which is my journal, we don't make that distinction. We love all. And Charlotte, you do.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Jenna in as far as my writing goes. Most of my writing starts as what I think of as poetry. But then I find that, I want it to be a little more structured. And so then I'll kind of morph it into more of a flash fiction. And my flash fiction, actually, I didn't mention earlier when I said I didn't care about structure or genre. That's not exactly true. It was true about this piece. But I write a good bit of flash fiction that is grounded in my Southern roots. It's very much local. It's very much culturally Southern. And I kind of find I have trouble placing those pieces. So anyway, but you just said that you have the magazine, what is it, John?
That's the Journal of Radical Wonder.
Yes. I have, I've read it, and I have a couple of friends who've been in it. I'm really excited now to know that.
Oh, well, I'd love to have your work.
I'll look into that. But also, I just wanted to ask kind of a nuts and bolts question to Jenna, because as I was listening to her story, I'm like, that sounds familiar. I think I've read that story. Was it published anywhere?
It was published, I think, back in 2017 in a New Zealand magazine called North and South magazine. It was part of a competition, and it was a runner-up in the competition. So it might have gotten a little bit further. I'm not sure, but thank you.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm like, that is such a great story. I loved it. And I thought, that just sounds like I've read it somewhere before, but maybe not. But I love it. It was great.
Oh, thank you. It gives me the opportunity to say how much I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing everybody else's pieces today. In fact, I've been taking notes, taking the titles down. I'm quite keen to read these pieces, and it's been great to hear them. I now want to read them as well.
I agree with you.
Well, I think that's the perfect sort of capstone statement of this. And I hope everybody out there who's watching also goes and reads these stories and reads the work by these wonderful writers. That I've been spending the last week or so going over everybody's work, and it's just fabulous. thank you so much for including us in your festival. And I'll see you in the next episodes. We'll all be there watching. All right.
Thank you so
Thank
much. Lovely to talk with you all. Lovely to hear all your
Thank
stories.